set up. Welcome to everybody just joining us now. If you just bear with me for a moment while we wait for everybody to be admitted in from the Zoom, we're going to give some people a few more minutes to kind of trickle in before we start, and then I'll turn it over to Karen in a minute. Okay, so while we're waiting for a couple more people to come in, I'll just give my little housekeeping notes. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us today for our virtual talk. If I could remind you to just please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation unless Karen opens up some dialogue, and then feel free to unmute yourself and comment. If you have any questions, you can also type the questions into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker, Karen, would be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also use the chat feature in the comment section on Facebook Live to ask your questions and put in your comments as well. And we will be monitoring those comments and answering them at the end of the program as well. Please note also that this talk is being recorded and streamed live, and it will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube and our Facebook pages. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker to you, Karen. Her talk is entitled Artists and Their Mentors Who Inspired the Paintings in the Timken Collection. So thank you, Karen, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Blythe. Yes, this is actually revisiting of this concept of artists and mentors, but there will be new ideas and commentary added. You know, as I used to walk through the Timken, I noticed that we had so many pairings of artists and their mentors within our galleries, particularly in our Dutch and Flemish galleries. And I began to think about, this is a really fascinating topic because, as was stated in our Timken newsletter, behind every great artist, there seems to be a great artist. Now, what are the relationships between artists during this time? I'm going to be showing you work from the Renaissance through to the 19th century. So it does change a bit, but so there's a couple of variations. First of all, mentorship is an experienced and trusted advisor who aids us in our growth as an artist, for example, or other creative people. Other ways of gaining information, insight, and developing our careers is through working within workshops. So many of the artists, for example, we're looking at Leonardo da Vinci and Botrofio. Botrofio was one of Leonardo's students in a workshop. So we know over the course of art history, for example, the Bellini family during the Venetian Renaissance were great instructors of famous artists. Sometimes, however, it's not always that these artists worked in workshops, it's that they were inspired just to see the works of other artists. We'll see that a little bit later on in the 19th century. Lastly, I do want to mention that mentorships have existed since the ancient Greek times. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle provided mentorships. We also had something called the guild system, and the guild system lasts from about 11th century to the 16th century. And so we had guilds of artists working. However, as the medieval times changed into the Renaissance, we had less of the guilds and more of things like workshops. So without any more dialogue on that, I am going to go to our images. So let's look at this amazing partnership here. What we have is, on the right, we have Jan van Eyck, and on the left, our very own Paetus Christus, which is in, of course, the Timken Museum. Now, the Madonna of Chancellor Roland is in the Louvre Museum, and we talked about that last week. I would say one of my absolute favorite paintings in Western art is the Madonna of Chancellor Roland. And why is that? Because it's so exquisitely done, but also look at all the components in this painting. We have landscape, figurative, religious, we have still lifes, we have the study of light and detail. There's so much, it's so profoundly beautiful. So Jan van Eyck was the mentor to Petrus Christus. It is really interesting, however, that we really can't identify exactly their relationship. Some people say that that Petrus Christus did study with Jan van Eyck directly, and that upon Jan van Eyck's death, Petrus Christus actually took over his workshop / studio. And that's kind of where we're going to go today. Some people would argue that it was more of a little bit of a distant relationship, but there's many statements throughout history that suggest that Christus did definitely study with Jan van Eyck. Two really significant things about each of these arts. Jan van Eyck was credited in the Netherlandish region of really developing oil painting. He did not create oil painting, but he used a form of glazing that enhanced the richness and beauty of that medium. You can even see it in the cloak of the Virgin Mary, that deep, rich red. You can also see that with Petrus Christus, because although he wasn't really experimenting necessarily with oil painting, he did something that was profoundly important to the development of Western painting, and that is single point perspective. So each of these men in their own right developed as brilliant artists, but also contributed greatly to art history. Now, Jan van Eyck was part of the Burgundian court. So during this time, in the 15th century, it was predominantly run by the French aristocracy and court. It wasn't till about 60 years later that we have the takeover of the Flemish region by the Spanish court, Spanish Habsburg. So at this point, this area, which would be Bruges, where these two men mostly worked, Bruges, which is in today Belgium, a wonderful city, they were under the auspices of the French court. Something else that they both share is their involvement with manuscript illumination, because manuscript illumination trained many of these artists. This is just before the advent, if you look at Jan van Eyck, this is just before the advent of the printing press, 1440. So many of these artists trained as manuscript illuminators, meaning they drew along the pages of these handmade books. By the time that Petrus Christus is painting the Death of the Virgin, books are being printed. However, they both started out with manuscript illumination. So because Jan van Eyck is the teacher to Petrus Christus, I'll start quickly with this painting. And again, it's rich with symbolism, beauty, religious significance. Chancellor Roland was with the Burgundian court, and he worked in Autun, A-U-T-U-N, a French city, and he was one of the wealthiest men in that area. He had vineyards that grew grapes for wine. He was a massive landowner. In fact, if you look to the left of the painting, you will see some vineyards, and that indicates what he did. On the right, you see Gothic architecture, which indicates the spires to heaven. We have, however, a Romanesque series of arches. These are representing the Holy Trinity. This is Romanesque as opposed to Gothic. It's rounded and shorter. And we have exquisite capitals here, sort of a hybrid of Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic. It's kind of a hybridized capital. And we have this beautiful loggia, an open porch. We have the Virgin, who doesn't really look at the Chancellor, nor does he look at the Virgin. What this indicates is that probably this was more like an apparition, a celestial apparition, that Chancellor Roland was seeing her as she appears in his loggia, but she's not really there. It's symbolic. And what kind of indicates that is this line here, that demarcation of celestial and earthly. Earthly, celestial. We have an angel who hovers over the Virgin Mary with this exquisite crown of heaven. And it's hard to see because we have things on her wings are actually like rainbow wings. They're beautiful. And then the Christ child holds his fingers in benediction and holds an orb, the globe, as in Salvator Mundi, savior of the world. The chancellor, at one point, there was pintamento, that means hidden traces of a prior painting, where he had a money bag right here. But I guess it was taken out. People thought, maybe it's a little too much, a little too in your face, his wealth. But look at the clothing. Oh my goodness. The Virgin's red crimson robes with inlaid pearls and beautiful gems. He also has this exquisite ermine capped cape. He sits at a prayer desk, so he's kind of on his knees. She sits in the throne of wisdom. It's a brocade pillow that's behind her. And just really quickly, some people would say that this perhaps is Jan van Eyck right here with the red cat and one of his helpers. We have peacocks that represent eternal life and magpies that represent evil. So again, this is a metaphorical reference to good and evil, and peacock's everlasting life. So we have, pardon me, we'll just finish up here a little bit. And we have this inlaid floor. So it shows the power and beauty of Burgundian painting. Jan van Eyck, one of the greatest Netherlandish painters that ever lived. So of course, Petrus Christus learned from his interactions with Jan van Eyck, his use of color. Look at that deep crimson. However, if you look at the faces, you might say, well, they don't look as developed. Rest assured, Petrus Christus had a beautiful command of portraiture. We have an exquisite small portrait done by him at the LA County Museum, and you can see just this very, very human-like configuration of the face. These look a little more ovid. So you have more of an ovid style. What does this whole painting represent? The death of the Virgin does not come from the Bible. It comes from apocryphal literature. So these are stories told and handed down. But there's three sequences within this painting. Again, painted in Bruges. Bruges, very influenced by the Italians and vice versa. Petrus Christus even, I believe, went into Rome as well. So they learned from the Roman and Italian artists, and Bruges was so developed as a city with a lot of commerce that it was not uncommon for Italians to come into Bruges and vice versa. Okay, so the three segments of this. We have the Virgin as she lays dying on her bed. The candle is not only her purity, but her spirit rising. You see she rises up to be embraced by God, who is right here with a series of angels who hold a canopy to capture her. Then, so it's the Virgin as she dies, her soul rises to heaven. And if we go to the diagonal, we see doubting Thomas. So doubting Thomas is saying, well, is she really dead? Could it be? It's so terrible. And this angel says, yes, her belt was taken, and we now see that she has been deceased. We have this idea of single port. I apologize. Sometimes my computer does move on. One thing we have in common, we both have these open windows, this use of architectural elements in the paintings that Christus learned from Jan van Eyck. We also have this beautiful incorporation of landscape. And we have the ability of movement here, because as he creates this movement in the painting, we feel as if these apostles and mourners are greeting her. And then we see abject grief. So beautifully detailed, rich with color, single point perspective, and also the development of oil painting. Next, we're going to go to two marvelous examples, and probably to me the most salient, meaning to me they're most identifiable, that Giovanni Botrofio studied within Leonardo da Vinci's workshop. And they studied together in Milan. Botrofio was actually Milanese aristocrat, And he studied in the workshop of Leonardo da Vinci when he was in Milan. Now, Leonardo da Vinci worked in many cities. He worked in Milan, he worked in Florence, he worked in Rome, and he also died in France. So, and some other small areas around there. So he did go to many areas. But if you look at these two faces, really you see so much of some similarities. To be honest with you, it was thought that this Botrofio, the portrait of a youth holding an arrow, was actually by none other than Leonardo da Vinci. But subsequently, it was proven that is very own Botrofio. Now, Leonardo felt Botrofio was his most famous pupil, as I stated, but Botrofio never reached the height of Leonardo da Vinci, someone who comes around every 2,000 years in terms of brilliance. We all know Leonardo was a scientist. He was scientifically, mechanically, he was an engineer, he was a painter, so many things about him that point to genius. So let's talk a little bit about the beauty of the portrait of Mona Lisa, probably one of the most famous portraits in the world. And I talked about it last week a little bit. It is, of course, in the Louvre. It's most probably famous painting, most famous portrait ever, I think. But look at the two faces. The eyes are almost identical. The noses are almost identical. Now, of course, this is a Florentine woman, and this is, of course, a male youth, but he has a bit of an androgynous look to him. And we also see less of the use of what's called sfumato. Leonardo da Vinci was known for really developing the idea of sfumato, which means smoke. And sfumato is lighting technique. And you can see, there's so many lighting techniques, chiaroscuro and tenebrism and sfumato. So sfumato is a smokiness around the eyes. And we really don't see it quite the same way in the Botrofio, but just understand that light, when we looked at the two Netherlandish paintings before, the Jan van Eyck and the Pages Christus, those artists were really examining light, because here we are in the Renaissance, and light and science and the world are being examined. And so light is often featured in these paintings. Now, so the faces are very similar. With the Mona Lisa, she was the wife of a man, Giocondo, and she's called La Gioconda, to her name, but also it relates to the word smile because it's very close in Italian. She was a Florentine aristocrat, although you don't see a lot of evidence, jewelry, embellishments, we call those attributes. You don't really see the attributes of the wealthy, but we know that she would not be painted by none other than Leonardo da Vinci if she were not from a wealthy Florentine family. Something that's really remarkable is that Leonardo incorporates very successfully landscape into portraiture. Many artists are starting to incorporate landscape. If we look at, for example, a little further on, the Venetians, definitely Giorgione, Titian, they were Venetian, but they really incorporated a lot of landscape. But look at this. This middle ground is more warm, earthly tones, but then we get this almost celestial, it isn't supposed to be heaven, but it's almost like the celestial beauty of the background. She holds her hands over what looks like a chair railing or a low, not a balustrade because that would be ornate, but just sort of a low balcony. And then, of course, you see this beautiful face with the sfumato. She has a scrim here that is almost like a headdress and that very enigmatic smile. We notice that both do not have exposed teeth. We've talked about the fact that dental care was kind of non-existent at that time. So Botrofio studies with Leonardo da Vinci, and he gains a lot of similarities to his work. So let's talk about the Botrofio a little bit. He wears a crown of leaves, laurel leaves, and he has an arrow. It is sometimes said that this is Apollo, the god of creativity and other, development of art and things like that. But it could be that, and he always had the arrow, but it could be that this is a portrait of Cassio, a Milanese aristocrat that Botrofio knew. And Cassio was a poet. And remember, Apollo cultivates poetry because he's the god of the arts. So we're not quite sure about that. Second of all, look at the beautiful, I apologize, the beautiful pendant, the pearls. I've talked about this many times. Pearls are the bling of that time period and later. And so you would often find a very well-heeled aristocrat embellished with pearls. And he holds, as I said, that arrow. So Lord Elgin purchased this, and he was an owner of this. And remember, Lord Elgin was known for the Elgin marbles. He took those beautiful carvings off the Parthenon and took them to England, where they are now. And there's a lot of controversy in art history whether those should return, but we won't talk about that. So Botrofio, great pupil, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, we are going to look at our very own Giovanni Savoldo. This is in the Timken. Savoldo did not study in a workshop with Bosch, but Bosch, a Netherlandish painter, was known to do such great artwork that many Italians were familiar with Bosch's work. So Savoldo knew of Bosch's work, and we know directly because he quoted, if you look at hell, which is represented here, and hell, which is represented here, you can see even direct copying of these fanciful figures. So again, sometimes artists develop their work not by studying directly with these artists, but by examining their greatness. So we'll talk a little bit about Bosch, and then we'll see how our own Timken Savoldo, this magnificent Italian painting, was inspired. Now, Savoldo was Venetian, although he worked in a little bit in Florence, and he worked around that area. A lot of important Netherlandish artists were known in Venice. But who was Hieronymus Bosch? Bosch actually came from what would be today the Dutch region of that area. Before actually in the late 1500s and early into the 1600s, Holland and Belgium were bifurcated, and the Dutch remained Protestant during the Protestant Reformation. And what would be today Belgium became still under the Habsburgs. So the Belgian artists continued to paint more Catholic themes, and the Dutch artists more Protestant themes. However, if you look at the date, this is before the Protestant Reformation, 1517. And so where Martin Luther, 1507, I believe, 1517, put the edicts on the church and developed more of Protestant religion. So this is more under the guise of the Catholic religion. And Bosch was from a wealthy family, and he was sponsored by an aristocrat who actually asked this altarpiece, 3-panel piece, to be painted. And Bosch was a very religious person himself. And so what do we have here? We have what's called a triptych, 3 panels. We have the central panel that's always larger, and then these doors can close. There's actually a grisaille, a beautiful gray drawing on the outside, but we'll concentrate on the inner core of the painting, the altarpiece. If you look at the sky, they're identical. They merge one heaven, paradise, into reality, into earth, but it totally changes when we go to hell. So what basically the meaning behind this altarpiece, the Garden of Earthly Delights, is that man needs God's guidance in order to conduct a good life. And it was thought that Bosch was also looking at parables to say, for example, that earthly pleasure is like a glass bubble. It can break and it's very fragile. So he's commenting on some very significant topics that were occupying people in the early Renaissance, in the Renaissance and medieval times. So instead of having really a landscape, Adam and Eve, it's again a very fanciful landscape. These animals look like they're drawn from the imagination, and we have again this very blue and otherworldly mountain formation. And here we have God holding the hand of Adam and Eve. Now, there's a lot of sensual, sexual aspects to this, but that wasn't his intent. He was commenting on it, but it does show that Adam kind of looks at Eve in a more sensual way. And that kind of goes into here. And this is earthly realm. And we do not see any children, which is kind of significant, but we see a lot of people cavorting in a sensual way, multiple figures, and these fanciful biomorphic forms, and water and animals. And I will say that with surrealism, a movement that I've studied, people say, oh, it's so surreal. And of course, people like Salvador Dali and other surrealists were very inspired by Bosch, but the intent wasn't surrealistic. It was more imaginative. So there is a bit of a overlap, but the intent wasn't exactly surreal. Here we have three manners of hell. So we have Adam and Eve, and it goes into the realm of earthly pleasures. But then, of course, when we overdo it, we don't practice temperance and moderation, we get a hellish landscape. So we have, level 1, a level 2, a level 3. So this is hell. And you see it right here with the Savaldo. What is so fascinating about this part of the panel is if you look very closely, and I'm going to point it out right here, that is actually a portrait of Bosch himself. So he actually incorporates his face. It's shockingly interesting to me. He has like a hat with some figures here. He has ears with a knife to slice through words. We have all manner of weirdness, musical instruments. We have a music on the back of people. We have a nun with a face of like a porcine face. It's hellish. It's a hellscape. So for want of time, I'm going to go into the hellscape of Savaldo. So Savaldo is commenting on Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony started the monastic orders. So he's running to a monastery. He developed monastic orders, and he runs away from hell and damnation. But I also want to point out that during this time, when this was painted, the plague was again circulating through Italy and Europe. So the idea of the plague is never far away from these people. So as Saint Anthony races away from hell, the plague, and damnation, he goes to the light and beauty of the monastic order. In fact, this very painting is bifurcated by a rock formation, separating heaven and hell. And heaven in terms of religious spirituality. And it's beautiful. Now, St. Anthony was tormented by visions, and they say that maybe even Savaldo too might have suffered from things might have been like epilepsy, perhaps. Not terribly sure. But if you look at these little creatures, so similar. One thing I want to point out too is that here we have people marching toward hell, and we kind of have the same thing here. Now, it's my supposition this center portion shows a ship with multiple people. And it's my supposition that during that time, they did not understand mental illness. So what they would do is they would put people on ships and push them out to sea. It's called the Ship of Fools. So it was a hellish concept. So I think that also might be seen in that painting. Okay, so we're going to move on, and we're going to look at, on the right, our very own St. Bartholomew by Rembrandt, one of the greatest artists who ever lived. It's so nice that in our Dutch and Flemish galleries, which will be hopefully reopening in May, I can't wait, we have his very own student, Nicholas Maes. Some people say Maas, it's Maes, and he was a Dutch painter. And so he studied for 5 years in the studio of Rembrandt. However, even though he's greatly influenced by Rembrandt, and Rembrandt thought Maes was one of his greatest students, he also taught Fabridis, who died young, who's an amazing artist. He had many great artists coming from his studio. But as we look at the work of Peter Paul Rubens, which we're going to look at successively, after this, you will see this is more Flemish Baroque than Dutch Baroque. So at this time, we're still in the Baroque, but of course, Holland is a different country. It's Protestant. And so we have Protestant themes as opposed to Catholic themes. However, Rembrandt was a great painter of everything: history, portraiture, still lifes, landscapes. He did it all. He was very great as a religious painter. And he paints one of the 12 apostles, St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew was flayed alive for his beliefs. You see the knife here. Actually, at one point, the knife did not even exist in the painting. It was painted over. A book was put in its place, but subsequently it was said that it made no real reference to the saint, so the knife was put back. Now, Saint Bartholomew is a tragic figure, and so was Rembrandt. And in many ways, I believe that Rembrandt is showing his own moral and ethical dilemmas, because he had lost his wife about 14 years before. She died around the time just after her only living son Titus was born. And actually, she birthed Saskia, who gave money and prestige to Rembrandt's life, helped him build a beautiful studio and home. She lost all of her children except for Titus, who actually died at 27. So it was a very tragic home. In 1656, Rembrandt declares bankruptcy. And so 57 is a pretty terrible time for him. Why does he declare bankruptcy? Well, he had a lot of students, he had a lot of commissions, but he lived way beyond his means. So the consternation on the face of the saint mirrors a lot of what he was doing. Now let's talk about this chiaroscuro here, this beautiful use of light. He was aware of the work of Caravaggio and the artists who developed light. He too incorporates a lot of light. And one little tidbit of information I do want to mention, Rembrandt has something very similar to Vincent van Gogh, and is that they were both great artists of self-portraits. So you can find many, many self-portraits of Rembrandt and also of Vincent van Gogh, a countryman who was extremely influenced by Rembrandt. So we have a very monochromatic background. The only attributes really is the knife, and it seems very gestural and very painterly, which is very unusual really when you look at his students' work done 20 years later. This is a very aristocratic portrait. And as you know, the Dutch were more middle class. This is the time of the growth of Holland, but she is an aristocrat. In fact, Mary was the partner to William of Orange. She was a British aristocrat, English aristocrat, and she married William of Orange, and they became William and Mary. So you often have portraits done by great artists because you are of a high social standing. The thing that is so remarkable about this painting, and here we have motion, but it's a little more static. This is a moment caught in time. The little dog, the little lap dog, which relates to fidelity, Fido. I talked about that with the Arnolfini portrait of Jan van Eyck a few lectures ago. He's trying to get away from her. So she's trying to hold him steady. And there's a lot of movement here with this beautiful drape and this elegant sky with the poplar trees, or perhaps it's cypress. And it almost seems like the wind is fluttering through a window. Can't really tell. She has exquisite cream and yellow gown with the ubiquitous pearls of their aristocracy. This is starting to slide down her shoulder a bit. And she has that look of confidence because she is an aristocrat. And when I show you the next set of paintings, I want you to understand that even though he trained directly in the workshop for 5 years with Rembrandt, Mies was very influenced by none other than Peter Paul Rubens. If you look at this portrait, you see some similarities. You don't see the movement, but you see how Anthony van Dyck was a student of Peter Paul Rubens, just like Mies looked at Rubens' work. Another great pairing in the Timken are these two mentor, and student. So what is this painting about? If you look at the date, 1620, Peter Paul Rubens was one of the greatest Netherlandish painters. He was married to a woman named Isabel Brandt, who had a lot of money, but he was extremely successful. When he was a young man living in Antwerp, he was an intern or under the tutelage of a very wealthy woman. And she was a countess, and he learned from this countess manners, decorum, languages, and he literally worked for some of the most important courts of Europe, in Spain, in Italy. He actually painted the Medici cycle. Some people said he was a spy for the Duke of Mantua. So there's a lot of stories about him, but his workshop and his studio were hugely successful. He employed many, many artists, and he taught many artists, as in Anthony van Dyck. Now, what we're looking at is what's called a trony. A trony is like a stock painting, which might have been used for much larger historical paintings or even religious paintings, but it was always kept kind of in the studio. At first, they thought this might be the Duke of Mantua, but later, no, probably not. There was no evidence that the faces were the same. But look at his use of light. This chiaroscuro, as the light falls right on this beautiful face with this mop of curls and this red crimson. Now, the Baroque, unlike the Renaissance, was much more emotional, dramatic, and more on the diagonal. So often you would see, not always, but you would often see this use of the diagonal and this great armor here. It has such substance, and then a very gestural, painterly background. Now, if you look at these two, you can see that Anthony van Dyck has a more classical, a little bit of a tighter brushstroke on his Mary Villiers. And she was Lady Herbert of Sherland. She was painted by Anthony van Dyck because Anthony van Dyck developed into one of the most important portrait painters of the 17th century. And even though he was Flemish, actually originally from the Dutch region, but he was Flemish in his upbringing, he worked at the court of Charles I. So Anthony van Dyck knew Mary Villiers' father, who was an upper aristocrat who worked in the court of Charles I. And so he got to know the court, and then he became court painter to Charles I in England. So let's tell the sad tale of this young woman. When she was about 14, I believe. Now, the portrait, I just want to go back for just a second. Mary here is 15. Remember, they married young. Here we have Mary Villiers, she's about 14, and she loses her husband to smallpox. Horrible. So she's in mourning. And what Van Dyck does is paint a flower here. She holds a wilted flower. Now, you have to remember that the Dutch and Flemish artists were very interested in what's called vanitas or memento mori, a memento of death or a significant reminder of something. And this is a reminder of death. Flowers are ephemeral. A small rosebud will be closed, but as it opens, it is our life maturing. And then as it fades, we have what's called, the decline, and that represents death. So she holds a flower, not of her youth, but of what she's gone through. Now, someone might say, she's in a pretty elegant lemon-colored gown. It's exquisite. But remember, she was an aristocrat from a very important family, so she wasn't going to stay unmarried. However, she mourns the death of her young husband, who was only about 15 or 16 himself, with these black ribbons. She is elongated. Anthony van Dyck wanted to, learning from Rubens, to somewhat elongate figures. It gave them more height and importance. So she's rather elongated. She does look very sad, however. We see this woman in mourning, but she also is youthful. She looks directly at us. Look at all those pearls, as we just talked about, and this exquisite silk gown. Like the Rubens here, there is very little, the attributes, of course, the flower and the black ribbon, but there's not really any attributes behind either figure. he also used his very own style of yellow and brown. It was a Van Dyke color. He really developed these colors and very unique to him. So when you visit the Timken, when we reopen in May, it'll take a moment to look at not only the Rubens, the Merivilliers, but also the pairing of Rembrandt and Maes. All righty. So we're going to go into what was our French gallery and look at two Rococo painters. So we looked at the Renaissance, some Renaissance artists. We're looking at two Rococo artists. So Francois Boucher was the teacher of Fragonard. And Boucher really developed what we call the Rococo style during the court of Louis XV and his Madame Pompadour, who loved Boucher and spent a lot of time supporting him. What do we have here? We have the aristocrats in a garden, lovers in a park. This is an enormous painting. When you visit the Timken or have visited the Timken, you will see that this is our largest painting. Why is that? Well, of course, we acquire magnificent masterpieces, but this was meant to be hung at a higher level. So it might have been in an opera house or a theater, meant to be looked at from a distance. If you look at the colors, they're similar but yet different. Here, Boucher still connects with the palette of the Baroque. By the time we get to his student Fragonard, it's very, very pastel and really Rococo in nature. Now, the aristocrats in both paintings, this is a very large painting, this is a very small one, but of course you can see Fragonard's been inspired by Boucher. Here we have what's called an Arcadian style landscape. Arcadian landscapes were one that showed impossible beauty and fanciful landscapes. And so this is similar. We have a young man, an aristocrat. He's not really looking at the young girl. He's sort of picking flowers from her hair, but he looks at this milkmaid. She's not a servant. She's also an aristocrat. They often like to dress up in costumes. We have a dovecote here where the aristocrats would sometimes raise doves. I beg your pardon. We have these little putti. They loved Greco-Roman sculptures in the gardens. And we have all these manners of flowers. And so there are three little issues with this painting that you would have never see if you saw it from a distance. And it's not that Boucher wasn't a brilliant artist. He studied with Watteau, brilliant artist, but it wasn't really meant to be seen close up. So what do we have here? We have these truncated legs that if you look really closely, don't seem to fit the body. If this young aristocrat were to stand up, she would be like 7 feet tall. And we have a path that's really non-existent. So where does the milkmaid come from? So those are little interesting tidbits. Now we have the dog, and the French aristocrats often had lap dogs, but it also indicates fidelity. You know, it's kind of a, sardonic comment on here. This man's looking at another woman, but yet he's supposed to be in a couple. So because I only have about 5 more minutes, I do want to get to our beautiful Fragonard here. Blindsman's Bluff was a game played by the Ancien Regime, the ancient regime of the aristocratic court. And he was inspired by, not inspired, but promoted by the successor of Louis XV, Louis XVI. And so this is at the height of the aristocracy. Now, Boucher and also Fragonard worked beyond painting tapestries, Sèvres porcelain. So they were very busy, very influential. We have a moss-colored tree. And this tree was so interesting to our Timken curators and directors that we brought in a few years ago a very famous Ramon de Salvo, a famous UCSD professor, and he actually recreated a contemporary version of this magnificent tree. So we had a great pairing, juxtaposing of contemporary versus historical. So we have these candy box colors, pinks and blues. We have this game played, and we have here a sculpture. To me, it looks like Zeus. And you have to remember that Zeus overlooked, not overlooked, but he often would transform himself and come to earth and frolic. And so maybe that's what Zeus is doing here. But because we have one more grouping, I would like to just talk momentarily about two more paintings, just for 2 more minutes before we take questions. So we have here Thomas Birch, an American ship in distress, from our very own Timken collection. And Thomas Birch did not study with Vernet. But Vernet in the 18th century was the most prominent French, or one of the most prominent French marine painters. So, as was Thomas Birch in America. Thomas Birch was the contemporary of Thomas Cole, and he developed his own branch of what we call Hudson River painting. He did many paintings of the War of 1812. That's where he kind of got his painting legs, but he loved shipwrecks. So he's painting a shipwreck where the boat is about to capsize, the sails are torn, a steamship races in to try to help out. These people are trying to load into the lifeboats. This is definitely a ship in distress. You can see the white-capped mountains, the translucent water, the exquisite clouds that he had seen in Dutch painting. You see that big horizon line. And then we look at Vernet's. Now, Vernet's work is quite different. It's much more kind of romantic. Not that this isn't romantic, but we see a composite landscape. Vernet was from Avignon, but he went to Italy and painted. And most of his career was in Italy. So if you look at this lighthouse, it's from Naples. And if you look to the corner, I don't know if you can see it, there's an arch that comes from Rome. And then we have these sails that are actually from the Mediterranean. So he shows travelers. And we have everything from these beautiful figures that actually show inspiration from faraway places. And we have, these two are begging me to. And then we have everything from prostitution going on here, because we see men going into these ships. And so we see a Dutch flag because a Dutch, a person commissioned this painting. Now, I am going over just slightly, and if you can just bear with me for 2 more minutes. I see Blythe is almost ready to take questions, but I just really quickly, I would like to show 2 of our remarkable paintings in the Timken in our American gallery, and that is John Singleton Copley and Benjamin West. If you look at the dates, they're almost identical. Why is that? Because in reality, they were rivals, artistic rivals. 2 of the greatest American painters, one from Boston, one from Philadelphia, who both actually went on to England and painted. So just really briefly, this is one of our most beautiful portraits. In fact, Copley thought it was his best portrait of a woman. And Mrs. Thomas Gage was married. She was Margaret Kimball. She was married to Thomas Gage, who was the British overseer just before the American Revolution. This is done just before the American Revolution, colonial America. She was from a wealthy class. She married this famous general. She wears a turban, which indicates first that her father was Turkish, but also that many women in the 18th and 19th century were dressing up from what they saw from travels, beautiful garments, caftans, and so forth. She looks very intelligent. She wears a loose garment. This was meant for her husband, not for a state portrait, because she's wearing a loose non-ball gown. Balls were not occurring at this time. But look at the detail, the light as it falls on her beautiful face, the details on this exquisite chair, the embellished, the belt with the pearls. It's just remarkable. Lastly, Benjamin West. This is not from Greek mythology. This comes from Edmund Spenser, who was an Elizabethan poet, and he wrote The Fairy Queen. Each chapter talking about Christian values, truthfulness, fidelity, all the important values. And so this is really commenting on that. And we have a faith and hope. And Fidelia has the New Testament she grasps. She's in contrapposto, a style of Greek sculpture, although this is not Greek mythology. she holds a snake, and it's my supposition here that faith was so powerful that even a snake in a goblet could not deter her. And then we have Hope, who has the anchor, that's her attribute. And we have the Red Knight, who goes into this magnificent realm of truth. And Una is leading him in, and he has a spear. He's going to go into the realm of truth. And we have this just beautiful landscape and this arch. So I'm going to end there, but we can see that throughout these pairings, we saw artists who worked in studios. We saw artists as rivals. We saw artists who took over from other artists, but it's just a very important relationship, mentor, student. So with that, I'll end. And Blythe, do we have questions?
Thank you so much, Karen. That was just wonderful to listen to. It was really a great presentation. And I don't see any in the chat at the moment, but I'd like to take this opportunity to just give anybody a moment if they want to add something into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself at this point to ask Karen a question directly if you'd like. Also on Facebook Live, you can use the comment section there as well, and we'll be monitoring those, and I can relay those questions to Karen as well. So now the floor is open for any questions anybody might have.
We love questions. They're fun. So most of the time, if I can answer them, they're fun. I hope, I'm going to put a little plug in for the Van Gogh immersion that's in Del Mar right now. The reason why I bring it up is, if you're interested in the work of Rembrandt and you love Vincent van Gogh, it's just so nice, as I mentioned earlier, to see so many inspiring moments in Van Gogh's work that came from Rembrandt, whether it was the portraiture, the potato eaters, that was basically a quote from Rembrandt, Christ at Emmaus. I mean, there's so many ways that Van Gogh obviously didn't study with Rembrandt, but how he was inspired. And so even today, artists are looking back at historical figures and developing their own artwork based on what they see. That was just a little plug.
Yes, make sure you watch it. When is it going to be airing on the TV again, Karen?
Oh, yes. That's a nice, I didn't really mean to advertise that, but yes, the Channel 10 will be airing a little segment about the Timken and the Van Gogh exhibit. I did do a walkthrough with Kimberly Hunt, and that will be airing. I'm not sure the Timken will be informed about that. So it was really great because they sought us out to sort of advertise our wonderful museum, and also this great experience that people can have with these Van Gogh immersions. So thank you, Blythe, for mentioning that. That's very nice.
Of course, we have one question from Andrea asking, is it true that Fragonard died penniless, and was that due to the French Revolution?
100% yes and yes. That's a really brilliant comment, or interesting comment. Isn't that sad? This is a point too I want to make. Let me just go back, if we can, to look at it. What happened was, look at the time period. Yes, it was around the time of the French Revolution, but neoclassicism, when you think about Jacques-Louis David, who actually studied a little bit with Fragonard, neoclassicism, mythology, historical paintings relating to the French Revolution, and this artwork really went out of favor. When Boucher was developing Rococo painting, he's one of the developers of Rococo painting, it was the height of the aristocracy and everything that was going on. But by the time Fragonard came around, he lost a lot of, let's say, even Diderot made comments like, he doesn't tell the truth. His paintings don't tell the truth. So people got a little disenchanted. And so he did die penniless. And yes, the French Revolution was absolutely instrumental in bringing about his decline. So that was a very good question.
Thank you so much for that answer, Karen. And thank you to Andrea for the question as well. We have time now just for another question or two. If anybody wants to chime in, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll probably be wrapping it up pretty soon.
I like to, this is Dee Dee. When I used to take people through the French Gallery, I'd love to point out this Franz Boucher, 1758. It kind of early relative to the French Revolution, as you say, the peak of style and fashion and all of that. And you go into the townhouses of the elites, and they all had their walls painted with this gorgeous stuff. And Fragonard, being the student, you can see that the dates are just a little bit later, and he is bucking up towards the French Revolution and all the writings of the philosophes and the revolutionaries and all of that stuff. And both of them, well, Boucher had the good luck, I think, to die before the revolution, chop his head off, because the people were so against this kind of vanity and waste, when you think about taxes and the poor and all of that. But Fragonard actually got lucky enough, and I believe he went into exile in Belgium. And then when he managed to come back, once the revolution's heyday was over, and he did make another go at painting. So he lived, but it was hard. And by then, as you already mentioned, the neoclassical was definitely flooding the market. And so poor Fragonard took a hit. But
Yes.
we look back at that and we just love it. It's so gorgeous. It's blues and pinks, as you said, and that candy box sort of feeling it must have been a wonderful time. But by the dates, you can see this predated the revolution, and after that, everybody got serious.
And
So,
Didi,
yeah.
when you gave tours of the French Court, of course, we have our Jacques-Louis David,
Yes.
and a portrait. And, we all know that Jacques-Louis David was very involved with the revolution, but he withstood the revolution and went on to continue with a great career. And that's because he was, part of it was because he was so immensely talented that they decided, he's aligned with Robespierre, but we're not going to get rid of him quite yet because he's too important as an artist. So
he had what you call political elasticity. In other words, when he saw the writing on the wall, brother, did he change, and quick, so he basically kept up with the times and knew that the death of the Rococo was over, it's done. And so he moved rapidly and effectively and wheedled his way back into the power elites and did other kinds of work. So he survived and ended up painting Napoleon as Indian times, so he, again, just the political stuff. We forget that art is so influenced by what else was happening.
That's a great point. It's such an important point. We can't just look at art in a vacuum. We have to see what's going on historically in religious sense and in terms of revolution or technology. I mean, there's so much about the world in itself that has to influence art. And just as you said, politics really played a part in this time period.
It was a terrible time, very, very frightening. If you had any wealth or status at all, brother, I think it was really risky. And, they went after everybody, and there were thousands that went to the guillotine. I mean, thousands, so to have survived that era, when they call it a reign of terror, this is, political term that means exactly what it means. It was a terrible time.
Exactly. Very true. Oh, unfortunately.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that commentary, Didi. I think our next question was, did Fragonard leave France? And so I think you answered that question perfectly.
Didi, thank you for mentioning that, Didi, because you handled the next question.
Well, I think that's wrapping up our time. If anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to put those in the chat or unmute yourself. Otherwise, I wanted to just say thank you for coming to our talk today. And also thank you to Karen for giving us all this knowledge that you have and taking your time to teach us. It was really wonderful. And I also just want to make everybody aware that we also have this talk again next Thursday. And next Thursday's talk is entitled European Tapestries. So at the same time, 11.
Oh, that will be a nice kind of segue.
Yes, exactly. So I see no other questions. So I think we will end it there.
Thank you.
And thank you again to everybody, and hope to see you.
Thank you, Blythe, and thank you, Didi.
Of course.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.